Well, it's good to see so many familiar friends, brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's open with a word of prayer, please, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit, come and be among your people. Lighten our hearts with your fire, that we may save the unborn. Give us hearts to hear, legs to run, and arms to love. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Well, first of all, let's start out with a few definitions. Ohio's deep state. What is the deep state? Everybody knows from your civics class, we have three governments: legislative, executive, and judicial. But the reality is there's an administrative state appointed by the executive department, both at the federal level and at the state level. These administrative holdovers from one administration to another hold enormous power because you can't get rid of them. What happened with Donald Trump in the Russia collusion, that entire thing that you watched for 2 years was a deep state operation on the federal level. Agents in the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, who were forming a different government that was not elected, opposing the will of the people. This is what we speak of when we talk about the deep state. Right to Life Action Coalition of Ohio began to dig into this in 2018, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, we're going to talk first of all about the filthy nature of Ohio's abortion clinics. I'm going to go over the law in Ohio that allows complete deception and operation of ambulatory surgical centers. We're going to talk about one example up in Toledo, Terry Hubbard, and the awful Ohio Department of Health debacle that resulted after she was struck down by the Ohio Supreme Court. We're going to talk about what Right to Life Action Coalition did about that through the kind and generous help of the great legal minds at Thomas More Legal Clinic over in Chicago. By the way, it's not St. Thomas More, it's Thomas More. We're going to talk about what the Ohio Department of Health did to slap the pro-life movement in the face. We're going to then talk a little bit about Governor DeWine, both in his role when he was Attorney General, his appointment of Amy Acton, the Ohio Department of Health Director, and then we're going to wrap it up with what's next. So with your kind and keen attention, I'll walk you through several of these things. Let's begin with the center of death. The filthy truth about Ohio's clinics. This is a photo of Toledo's only remaining abortion clinic. Claiming to be the guardians of women's health and of good things for women, Capital Care Clinic is a perfect example of a center of death. The filth begins on the outside of the clinic. No signs, no proud names of the doctors, no women's banners, no rainbow LGBTQ banners. Nothing to identify what it is. It's parking lot in filthy disrepairs. The walls of grime and filth await women to come in. This is the faded graffiti painted brick and the filthy, dirty windows that face the main street. I've been there and prayed my rosary many times. Those windows have not been washed in 15 years. Unwashed and scummy, they provide a dim welcoming of dirt and callous caring to all who enter. The roof framing is rotted and crumbling. The paint, decades untouched, is peeling. Lack of maintenance. This is what awaits a mother as she enters to kill her child. The entryway is a pigsty, an unwashed glass door with a sloppy paper posted sign. The shutter is loose and peeling. The heart graffiti to the right of the door is Satan's mockery. The sidewalk is cracked, sprouting weeds of death. And as you can see, the concrete and the pebbles are broken up. This is a perfect reception to tell women how much you care for them. This is the back parking lot area. Viewed from the building, it shows filthy mold and weeds. In fact, the weeds are the only thing of life that's growing there. This facility on the outside looks like what we would have said in 1959, women have to go to back alley abortion clinics to have their abortion. And this is what it is. This is what's sanctioned and allowed in the laws of Ohio, perfectly legal. Well, as filthy as that clinic is on the outside, which is just to get your attention if you've never seen it, let's talk a little bit about the people who work on the inside. I'm going to show you just two of the abortionists, just two. And these are not unlike who practices abortion in the state of Ohio. Let's put it this way, in the old Donna Reed series from people that grew up in the 50s and 60s, this isn't Dr. Alex's business. Let's take a look at the first one. So this is Dr. Thomas Michaelis, MD. Dr. Michaelis was arrested in 1991 on a state charge in Lucas County Common Pleas Court. He was indicted on 2 counts of gross sexual imposition, which are first indicted on felonies, and pled down to 2 counts of gross sexual imposition, 1 of voyeurism and 1 of public indecency. The victims were 4 girls, 14 years old, who were having a sleepover at his daughter's house. The Ohio Medical Licensing Bureau demanded that he surrender his medical license. He did 6 months in jail. He traveled throughout the Southwest trying to find work, ended up doing abortions on a federal Indian land, came back to Ohio, and the medical board said he was rehabilitated and granted him a new medical license as a registered sex offender. Now, we do know in Ohio that most of the abortions, 70% of the abortions are done on unmarried women under the age of 23. So if you're a 17-year-old girl and you're pregnant and you go in to an abortion clinic and you don't want your parents to know, and you're the doctor that's a pedophile, who's going to know what happens between you and the patient? Well, he came back, he got hired by the abortion clinic. Not only was he working in Toledo, but he was the head of the medical committee at her second abortion clinic in Columbus. In May of 2014, the FBI broke into his house and seized his computer because he was the target of a federal child pornography ring of which he was the center. He was indicted. He pled guilty, surrendered his medical license, and is doing 15 years in a federal prison. Let's look at this winner. Here we go. I've got a problem with my slide here. What was this gentleman's name again? That's Dr. Thomas Michaelis.
Is it advancing with this?
No.
Okay, how about here?
No, it's locked. Well, while we're trying to work on that, let me tell you number 2. You can look at this picture. By the way, pray for him. Pray for his soul. Don't let Satan have this man. So number 2, Dr. David Perkins. Dr. David Perkins had his medical license revoked for 6 months. What he was doing, there he is.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What David Perkins was doing was issuing narcotics prescriptions and controlled substance prescriptions by the hundreds without recording it in the medical clinic's books. People would come in, they'd get opiates from him, they'd get controlled substances, and he wouldn't write it down. So he was suspended for 6 months. As soon as he got his medical license back, he was back to work as an abortionist at Capital Care Clinic. This is just a little taste. I could go on with some more of the people. Now, what we're going to be talking about, let's stop and make a few definitions here about how the law works in Ohio. Ambulatory surgical facilities are outpatient facilities. I'm sure you're all familiar with what they are. LASIK surgery, kidney dialysis. Abortion clinics fall under ambulatory surgical centers. Remember that. That's number 1. In the Ohio law, there's 2 forms of law. There's legislative code law, the Ohio Revised Code, and there's administrative regulations. That's the Ohio Administrative Code. Technical stuff, but you need to know it. Next, if an ambulatory surgical center gets, they're supervised by the Ohio Department of Health. if the Ohio Department of Health takes an action against an ambulatory surgical center, they can appeal that action first to the Common Pleas Court, then to the State Court of Appeals, and then to the Supreme Court. Okay? So that's framework. Under the ambulatory surgical centers laws, there's required to have a medical director and an administrator. Now, one would think that an administrator who runs the clinic on a day-to-day basis, on a full-time basis, would be somebody who has medical care, medical background that would help the patients. Kidney dialysis might have a registered nurse as the administrator. Plastic surgery, outpatient center might have somebody with a degree in hospital administration. Not so with ambulatory surgical centers that are abortion clinics. This is the lovely Skylar Beckwith. Skylar was the administrator of Toledo's Capital Care Clinic. By the way, I'd like you to take a good look at the logo in her hand. Does anybody see an upside down cross? Does anybody see a hand ripping into a womb? Just think about that. Just think about the subliminal message. Well, what was Skylar's background to qualify her to provide this administrative care of health to all these women? Well, she has an undergraduate degree in political science from Ohio State University. Then she got her master's degree in public policy from Central European University. Anybody know? Central European University in Hungary was funded and founded by George Soros. It's a cultural Marxist center. The government of Hungary, as you know, has turned out to be the most aggressive Christian government now in the Western world, and they shut it down in 2018. So that was her qualifications: politically trained, cultural Marxist. That was a university where people from all over the West would meet to become cultural Marxists. But while she was the administrator at Capital Care Clinic in Toledo, she was actually a full-time employee at Planned Parenthood in Lucas County. She was also a Democrat political party operative, having previously worked in the Ohio legislature and was the chief assistant for Democrat Lucas County County Commissioner. So while she was supposed to be the administrator of a clinic taking care of women, she was actually working at Planned Parenthood, not as a nurse, but as an intake officer and as a political operative in the local Democratic Party. In the summer of 2018, I began to ask some questions. Who are these people? Why have I been involved in the pro-life movement for a long time and I don't know who owns these clinics? What's their business model? How do they make money? How do they get registered? How come their names aren't on the building? How come no one can tell me who the doctors are? So we began to do some digging. What we began to find was the entire regulatory system in the state of Ohio, and it's probably true in other states, has regulations that are not centralized. You don't go to one place to get your ambulatory surgical center license. You have to begin with forming a business entity, for-profit or nonprofit. That's done at the Secretary of State level. The next level down is the health licensings, the inspections, and the revocation of facilities. That's done at the Ohio Department of Health. Then you have to face with professional licenses, medical, pharmaceutical, and nursing. And none of them talk to anybody. So if Dr. Michaelis is doing 15 years in prison, the Secretary of State doesn't know that, and the Ohio Department of Health doesn't know it. And by the way, why would they care anyway? So none of it's talking to each other. This presents you with a wonderful opportunity to manipulate the laws. And so what really started as nothing more than a simple research project for me ended up being 3 weeks of research. What we began to see, first of all, we went to the web and we began to pull information. This is where we found the information about who the abortion clinic doctors are. Went to LinkedIn to find out who Skylar Beckwith was, who these people were. Then we began to get into the Ohio Department of Health database. Well, who holds the license for Capital Care Clinic in Toledo? Oh, it's a name called Capital Care Clinic. So I go to the Secretary of State's website and find out, wait a minute, Capital Care Clinic isn't a business name, it's a trade name, licensed to an LLC. So here's what we began to see. The abortion doctors can never avoid patient liability. You nick a bladder, you kill a baby, you got liability. What they don't want is they don't want publicity. They don't want to crawl out from underneath their dark rock. If you talk to any doctor in Ohio, what they think of doctors that do abortions, they might even be for abortions, but ask them, what is the professional reputation of abortionists? And they will basically tell you they are the scum and the bottom rail of our profession. Well, we've already seen some of that. So, what they're doing is hiding from liability. Well, what kind of liability? Well, they don't want class actions. They don't want people to know where they live. They certainly don't want their name on the abortion clinic doors. They don't want liability for operations or slip and fall or fires. They don't want any of that. So what they do is they get somebody, well, let me stop here for a minute. What first thing we found is that it was so easy to get an ambulatory surgical center license. You're going to be shocked what I'm going to tell you. There's a licensing process by the Ohio Department of State and the Ohio Revised Code, and there's a relicensing process. Relicensing is more complicated. But the real initial requirements under the Ohio Revised Code 370230, if you want to look it up, is first of all, you have to have a building that's separate and distinct from a hospital or an inpatient care building. That's pretty simple. Have a building that's separate. Number two, you have to hold yourself out. Holding out means, hey, I'm in business here at this building, and you have to do the holding out requirement by advertising, simple internet, putting up a sign, hey, we're in the abortion business, or three, other promotional effects. You can be a sophomore sociology major at Bowling Green State University, open an office, put flyers out on the street, and you've met those two requirements. The third requirement is you have a quality control, infection control program. That basically means you keep the place clean. That's it. Don't have to be a doctor. Don't have to be a nurse. Don't have to be trained in abortion. Don't have to have any experience. Don't even have to be 21 to own and operate an abortion clinic. So here's the model. A doctor running an abortion clinic gets somebody in their abortion clinic to take on the liability that they don't want. That person forms, we're moving left to right, that person forms a limited liability company in Ohio. Limited liability companies do not have to disclose on the Secretary of State website who owns these companies. They can act in silence. Once they get a license as a limited liability company, they then come back to the Secretary of State and apply for a trade name. A trade name is not a business, it's just the name upon which you operate under. Now they're licensed, you don't know who the owners are. Now they have a trade name. Now they go to the Ohio Department of Health and make an application for a new first-year license. The Ohio Revised Code says if they meet those requirements, the director must give them a license. So now you have a new licensee operating, nobody knows who they are, they're not doctors, they're operating in a trade name, and they hide in the public just like the clinic you saw. Now the doctors have accomplished what they wanted. Well, then how do they do the abortions? Do they become employees? No. The Ohio law allows for independent contractor status, meaning the clinic can contract with the doctors, and that's exactly what they do. They charge a piecemeal for abortion. Every baby they kill, $750. They split it with the clinic and walk out. Now, it's not just that. It's that they travel between these clinics around the state. It's a network of abortionist doctors where these business units are set up, and they come in and do 5 abortions on Tuesday in Toledo. They go to Akron on Wednesday. They're in Columbus on Friday. That is how they've been operating for 20 years. Well, certainly when we found this, we were stunned. They're able to hide in plain sight. They're able to function without their names on there. Now, I hold personally professional licenses in law, public accounting, federal securities, and insurance. I can't say good morning without regulators breathing down my throat. Can you imagine a law firm that's being operated and run by a college history major? A public accounting firm that's being run by an undergraduate major in women's studies? This is what we have. So the question is, do other ambulatory surgical centers operate this way? The answer is no. We did the research. There's approximately 2,000 ambulatory surgical centers in Ohio. About 900 of those are affiliated with hospitals. We don't care about them. Hospitals are going to be very careful about messing up. Of the remaining 1,200, how many other of the ambulatory surgical centers that aren't abortion clinics follow this model? Any guesses? That's right, 0. Well, how does this play out? Great legal clinic, great business model that you cracked. How does this play out? Let's take a good look at the twisted story of Terry Hubble. In 2010, there were 3 abortion clinics founded by a doctor in Ohio. One was in Cuyahoga Falls, one was in Toledo, and one was in Columbus. In 2012, that doctor transferred, through this kind of a business model, the ownership to Terry Hubbard. Terry Hubbard is a registered nurse. She and her husband live in Mercer County. The law requires that you have to have a transfer agreement between your clinic and a hospital. And if you don't have a transfer agreement, and this will come into play at the end of my discussion here, you need a variance from the Ohio Department of Health. A variance says, hey, you don't have a transfer agreement, but if you have 3 doctors that do have admitting privileges, or 4 or 5 at a hospital, and they're there, we might let you operate anyway. Well, in 2013, before any of the licensing problems began to develop for Terry Hubbard, her clinic in Cuyahoga Falls was investigated by the Ohio Department of Health and was returned with 34 pages of healthcare violations. And these weren't, there's dirt on the floor. These are bio-waste not put away. These are opiates and drugs not locked up and not recorded. These are serious violations. She had the right to appeal that to the Common Pleas Court, as I told you. Instead, she chose to let that clinic be closed. 2 months later, the clinic in Toledo was approached. Now, you would think if you just had 34 pages of healthcare violations, you would get your clinic in Toledo and you would get your clinic in Columbus cleaned up and operating properly. Not so. 2 months later, the Ohio Department of Health came to Terry Hubbard and said, your transfer agreement with Ohio Medical College, UT, has expired. You're out of business. She said, oh, really? I'm going to appeal it to the Lucas County Common Pleas Court. She didn't have a transfer agreement. She operated for 6 months with no transfer agreement. The law is very clear. You cannot operate without a transfer agreement. She did it anyway. While the case was working its way through the Lucas County Common Pleas Court, she couldn't get a single hospital. Remember that, we'll come back to it. She couldn't get a single hospital to give her a transfer agreement. What she did was drove an hour and 20 minutes up to Ann Arbor and got Ann Arbor Medical Center to give her a transfer agreement. Well, a woman can bleed out in an hour and 20 minutes. The Ohio Department of Health regulations are that hospital must be within 30 minutes maximum of your clinic. Well, this is how things begin to work. Lucas County is a very Democrat county. So Democrat that when Dr. Thomas Michaelis was indicted, they knew his history and his background. When they reported it in the local paper, they refused to tell people that he worked at the abortion clinic. Why? Because the abortion clinic had been cited by the Ohio Department of Health and it was working its way through the court system, and they did not want to embarrass the clinic. So they merely called him a local OBGYN. So they got the press on their side. All the judges that are elected in Lucas County, with the exception of one, are Democrats, and they're Democrat actives, and they're pro-abortion. So the judge says, what the Ohio Department of Health has done to you is unconstitutional. They win at the Lucas County Common Pleas Court level. The Ohio Department of Health director, led by our Attorney General, says nothing doing, we're appealing. They go to the 6th State Court of Appeals. Court of Appeals says, yep, this is a constitutional law question. You can't block access for women. They win there. The Attorney General, then Mike DeWine, on behalf of the Ohio Department of Health, the plaintiff, appeals to the Supreme Court. While the case is on appeal at Supreme Court, this little thing happens. Not only is there no transfer agreement, but their own regulations require if a patient is in trouble, you have to call an ambulance to transport them to the hospital. Well, what they did, this woman was having severe problems. They threw her in the back of Skylar's van, drove her 3 miles to the Toledo hospital, dropped her off at the front door of the emergency room with no files and no records. You're on your own, baby, see ya. Ohio Department of Health found out. How did they find out? Well, one of our board members, who's here in the audience, is at that abortion clinic with his team day in and day out. And they found it. Mr. Bob Schoen and his team took a picture of it. Without their help, without being our feet on the ground, we wouldn't have found it. So they're in the middle of going to the Supreme Court. I want you to think about this. The clinic is closed in Cuyahoga County. She's under trouble in Lucas County. And while she's going through the appeals court, they do this. This is sticking your finger in the eye of the Ohio law. Well, she appeals that. So hold on to that for a minute, because we'll come back to that fine issue again. The case moves on. It goes into the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court in October of 2018 says, no, January of 2018, in October of, in 2018, the Ohio Supreme Court says, sorry, you lose. It was in January of 17, so it's early 18. January of 18, I'm sorry. Get my dates right. Is there any Bloody Marys in this room so I could start getting my thoughts together? Oh, it's Lent, I can't do that. So they decide the lower courts are wrong. Mike DeWine, the Ohio Attorney General, the Ohio Department of Health, fighting this battle through the courts, wins. Supreme Court says, not a constitutional decision at all. A totally proper application of the Ohio Department of Health's administrative rules. Get a transfer agreement, you are out of business. Now, it takes 60 days for that to become operation of law. On February 14th, after the Ohio Supreme Court decision was decided, but before it was official in April as operation of law, Terry Hubbard walks down to ProMedica, the largest employer in Northwest Ohio, and negotiates a transfer agreement. Well, wait a minute. why wouldn't she be able to get a transfer agreement from ProMedica before all this happened or during it? Why'd she have to go to Ann Arbor? Why didn't she get one from Mercy Health System or from University of Toledo? Why? The board at ProMedica did something they've never done before. They were pressured by their CEO. And they voted in a private vote. That's not done in board of directors. It was a private vote, my understanding, done over the phone. Deep state issue number one. By the way, it was revealed shortly after that, the CEO of ProMedica had a $30,000 a plate dinner for then candidate for governor Mike DeWine. I don't know if that was wrong or not, but it happened. That transfer agreement was signed by the Toledo Hospital to Terry Hubbard personally. And I'll never forget it because it was Valentine's Day, February 14th. The next day, she went to the Ohio Secretary of State and formed a new LLC. Remember our model? She formed a new LLC. Went to the Ohio Department of Health, filed a new application to become a new abortion clinic. I've got my transfer agreement. Well, we got a copy of the application, and the application was a blatant pack of lies. Number one, she claimed that the transfer agreement was with her new LLC, but the LLC wasn't formed until the day after she got it, because she probably didn't want to pay the corporate filing fees till she was sure she had her transfer agreement. The transfer agreement was not with her new LLC, it was with her. On the ambulatory surgical center applications, it asks a question: have you been the subject of a criminal offense, civil litigation, or an administrative action that could impact the patient's health? Her answer was no. What do you mean? You just went to the Supreme Court and you are in the process of a $40,000 fine litigation. She lied. And she lied flagrantly, and it was a lie that the Ohio Department of Health had to know. How could they not know? They were the plaintiff in the case. Is your blood boiling yet? Huh? This is what we're talking about with deep state. It was REGULATORS in Toledo and our board that heard this and said, we are not going to stand for this. As God would have things work, Molly Smith knew the great legal minds over at Thomas More, and she said, Jeff, I'm going to put you in contact with Thomas More. I presented them my story, and they said, unacceptable. We're online, we're going to help you file this, and we're going to fund it for you. We have one of their heroes right here, right now, standing in the back, Mr. Andy Bath. So it's now February 14th. Oh, let me stop. I can't help myself. February 14th. There's this great drink for Valentine's Day. It's 1 part Mai Tai mix. It's 1 part Jim Beam whiskey. And it's 1 bottle of the old Ballantine beer. Anybody remember Ballantine beer? Yeah. Mai Tai mix, Jim Beam whiskey, and Ballantine beer. You know what you call that drink on Valentine's Day? Beam my Ballantine. So, February 15th, they apply for the license. On April 16th, by operation of the order of the Supreme Court, Terry Hubbard's license is canceled. 10 days later, the Ohio Department of Health grants Terry Hubbard a new ambulatory surgical center license at the exact place. That's what the voters of Ohio get. We are a red state. We are a pro-life state. We are one of the greatest states in this country. Our people of Ohio have the biggest hearts. They are loyal. They stand up for their neighbor. Do you know that other than a Senate, there has not been a statewide elected Democrat in this state for 11 years? Do you know we have a supermajority in the Senate? And we have a very powerful pro-life group in the Ohio House of Representatives? And we have a governor who has a reputation for being pro-life his entire life. And yet what is going on in the deep state is they are thwarting the laws and the rules and the Constitution of the state of Ohio. It will not stand. We filed our complaint with the Ohio Department of Health. Well, why did we do that? Why didn't we just go to court? You must have, you can bring an action in the court, but before you do that, you must exhaust all your administrative capabilities. So we filed complaints at the Ohio Department of Health. Now, copies of this complaint went to then Attorney General Mike DeWine. It was October. The election was 3 weeks later. We didn't know if he got the complaint or not. Copy went to the Ohio Attorney General. Copy went to the Inspector General. Copy went to the Ohio Department of Health. Before Mike DeWine is sworn in as governor, but after he's governor-elect, we find another violation from Bob's group. I can't get into the details of how we came to this conclusion, but to operate a clinic and to be relicensed, you have to have an Environmental Protection Agency certificate from the state of Ohio to dispose of biohazard waste. They did not have one. You cannot operate without one. Think of it. Who's going to come in and certify you're getting rid of this stuff properly? And we all know what the biohazard waste is. We filed complaint number 2. About 4 days later, we get a response from the Ohio Department of Health on complaint number 1. It says, yeah, we're aware that we granted them a new license. And of course we're aware that they lost their license at the Supreme Court because we're the ones that took them to the court. Think about that. Yeah, we get your complaint, and yes, we did it, so what are you going to do about it? One thing else I didn't tell you. Terry Hubbard's clinic had $80,000 of Columbus tax liens for non-payment of payroll taxes in the state of Ohio, and $600,000 of federal tax liens for non-payment of federal taxes. Is it bad enough for you yet? Pedophiles, not paying your taxes, sticking your finger in the eye, dragging them up to the Supreme Court, winning, and then turning around and giving them a new license? Oh, but it's not just one. It's happened again. When Mike DeWine was running for governor, REGULATORS did not endorse him because he would not fill out our questionnaire. His opponent got endorsed. After that election, he came to Molly Smith and he came to Ed Sitter, and he said, well, I don't know how to say it, but he really wanted the endorsement of REGULATORS. He filled out the questionnaire, no exceptions. I'm a no exception candidate. We endorsed him. After the election, you remember going into that election, he was behind. He won by 4 points. And he credited the pro-Reich movement. Keep that in mind. Now, the last appointment has to be the Ohio Department of Health director. He's appointed all of his cabinet. Capitol Care's back in business. And we think, oh boy, we're going to get an Ohio Department of Health head that when we go in there and talk about this, they're going to help us. Well, he appoints Amy Acton. We'll talk about that in a minute. We don't hear anything. By summer, the Right to Life Action Coalition demands a meeting with the Ohio Department of Health director. We go down, we get a meeting, but we don't get the director. We get number 2, and we get a guy named Lance Hines. Molly's there from Cleveland. Meg Whitman's there from Cincinnati. Our president is there from REGULATORS from Dayton. I'm there. And they start out by saying, you know, we have to give these licenses out, and all we're doing is complying with the law. I said, no, you're not. You're not complying with the law at all, and we know it. And we're not going to let you get away with it. So we went through that meeting. We said, look, we're not going to be quiet. We're going to take this public. Do you want the Ohio Department of Health to be embarrassed? And they said, of course, no. And we said, well, what do you want us to do? 2 weeks later, Capital Care Clinics surrendered their surgical abortion license, Toledo. For the first time since Roe versus Wade, we're not having any surgical abortions in Northwest Ohio. But I don't know if any of you heard Sarah's talk yesterday. It's in the chemical realm. So they've jumped out of the Ohio Department of Health by surrendering their license, and they're doing chemical abortions, and we're quite certain this is a violation of criminal and civil law, unauthorized practice of medicine, unauthorized practice of pharmacy, and if we don't stop this, they're gonna have these chemical abortion clinics on every college campus, and 10 years from now, they'll be across from the high schools. We have a fight, and we're not gonna quit. You would think this would be enough, but then it happened in Dayton. By October of last year, we're raging. We can't figure out what's going on. Turns out Women's Med Center in Dayton, who had been through a similar litigation process and was shut down because they not only didn't have a transfer agreement, but they didn't have variances. Remember I talked about the variances? They had 3 of them, and the Ohio Department of Health said, ain't enough. Totally a discretionary law. They shut them down. They appealed. Montgomery County said, in light of the Toledo case, you lose. They appealed to the State Court of Appeals. State Court of Appeals case said, in light of the Toledo case, you lose. They appealed for jurisdiction to the Supreme Court of Ohio, and Supreme Court of Ohio said, go away. See the Toledo case. You're out of business. Margie Christie calls me. We're celebrating. Women's Med Center has been run by Martin Haskell. He was the pioneer in 9-month abortions. He developed the way to kill them that late. We finally got him. That, my friends, turned around the same way that Toledo turned around. Less than a month later, they go back and reapply. They don't even bother to set up a new company, just under a new name. And the Ohio Department of Health director gives them a new license when they took them all the way through the court system, twice. Governor DeWine calls Margie, who is not only head of Right to Life of Dayton, but our president for RELATCO, and says, don't get mad at Amy Acton. This was my choice. And we did it because we had to do it. We have a strategy. Bring your people down to Columbus. We will meet with you. Well, we all drive down to Columbus right before Thanksgiving. But before we get there, news hits the internet that really hammers the DeWine administration and the Ohio Department of Health. When we get into that meeting, the governor's not there. The attorney general isn't there. Nobody from the attorney general's office is there. The governor's chief legal and his number 2 guy is there. It was a Donnybrook. I asked them, have either of you seen the complaints that were filed at the Ohio Department of Health when the governor was then the attorney general? And they looked at us like we were from Mars. We threw the complaints down on the table. This is the first time they'd ever looked at them. First time. I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty quickly, but I'm going to finish this up. This is our governor. After the election, he asked Molly and he asked Ed Sitter from Toledo for nominations for the Ohio Department of Health director. We submitted a name, many of whom people in this room would know. A person who had deep experience, not a doctor, but lifetime experience in the medical profession, a real friend of the pro-life community, and he wouldn't appoint that person. Instead, he told Molly and Ed, I have a candidate that you are going to love. RELATCO and the pro-life movement is going to love. She's pro-life, but she can't say so publicly till she gets nominated. I'm thinking, wait a minute. We have a supermajority legislature in the Senate and a majority in the House that are pro-life, and she can't tell them that she's pro. Kind of weird. Well, after our meeting in November, And we're told don't blame our Ohio Department of Health director. A story comes out in Operation Rescue that our own Amy Acton was an Obama 2008 volunteer promoter. Here she is with her family, the Obama screen, Obama's picture in the back, pro-abortion, pro-Obama organizer. From that position, the good doctor went to the Columbus Foundation, where she was head of grants, and made grants to Planned Parenthood and NARAL. 8 years later, this Democrat is the head of the Ohio Department of Health. The woman, we were told, was going to be very pro-life, and we would be very happy about it. One of our people talked to Governor DeWine at a holiday event. We were demanding for her resignation. Now, if she got appointed, either his vetting process was terrible, or he knew it. And if he knew it, the question is, after everything he had been as an attorney general, and after what he had promised, why would he do it? This is what you find out about the deep state. There is another government. Not everybody in the Ohio Department of Health is doing this. They're at battle themselves. There's good Christians in the Ohio Department of Health that want this to end. There's people in the governor's administration. I believe Mike DeWine is a faithful Christian. I believe he has been pro-life. When you get into politics, you begin to dance with the devil. You are either, without exceptions, pro-life, or you're not. You do not, as a general in the Union Army, on the first day of Gettysburg, appoint a general to go into battle who's a slave owner. You do not do this. So what's our next move? Our next move with you, we're going to be working on the legal front, but here's your call to action. How many of you heard Mike Vorse at lunch? Pray. Turn up your game. Whatever you are doing, do it more. 25% more. More money. Write an extra 100, an extra 1,000, an extra 2,000, an extra $20 to the cause. Do an inventory of your skill and time. We have the greatest, smartest people in Ohio right here at this conference. You people are enormously gifted. Everybody in RELATCO, everybody I meet has very unique, wonderful, God-given gifts. Take them and use them for the pro-life movement. Use them. This next election's coming up. We know Governor DeWine's going to run again. We're going to get the word out to you later. We're going to stop this. We're going to be vocal. Get on the website when this is posted. Learn about it again. I'm available to talk to anybody about this at the political level. By the way, we're looking for good Christian lawyers, trial lawyers that want to join this fight. We need them. There's more fights coming than we have lawyers to deal with. If any of you know good Christian trial lawyers in your community, please see me. I want to get the names to Andy and to the St. Thomas More group. We need an army of lawyers too. So that's the deep state. That's what we're fighting against. But be not afraid. Be not afraid. We're not afraid. We've been asked by the governor's office to tone it down and be quiet. One of the things they don't want is they don't want the sunlight shined on their dark rock, and that's exactly what we're going to do, and we're not going to stop. We're going to leave here. We're going to write a paper. I promise you, within 6 months or less, this is going to be all over the internet. We're going to shine the light of truth on them, and may the Lord Jesus bless their souls. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Going to apologize. There's a discrepancy between our timer and the actual time, so we only really have about a minute for questions. On the other hand, Molly Smith has said that any question that you have of Jeff, she will ask him on her radio show. I also was told earlier today that questions will also be answered on the website too. So I'm not sure if I'm getting that message accurately or not. I don't know if it's both or one or the other, but some way we're going to try and answer all your questions. Okay, so please forgive us. So one question, and then please stay after this question, and I have some announcements, so I'll need you to please stay. So how about this question, if you can answer it? Would the LA law before the U.S. Supreme Court help the Ohio situation?
No, I think you're referring to the Diladen case in Los Angeles, is that? No, it won't. It really won't help. It won't help Ohio. It won't. So the real reason you can't answer questions is this. Years ago, I had a problem with driving in New York City. I didn't want to get around, and I was constantly speaking at very important tax clinics. And so I always had this one driver that took me to these places where I made my speeches, very complex tax laws and so forth, and I did it over and over again. And then finally I came to New York, but I got sick. And I had laryngitis, I couldn't talk, and I told him about it. He said, well, listen, boss, he said, I've heard you give that talk so many times, I can probably give it myself. I said, are you kidding? He said, no. I said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, you put my suit on, I'll put your driver's limo suit on, I'll sit in the back room and you give the talk, that'll be great. So he gives the talk, and it's really, it's all the top tax lawyers in the country. And it's time for questions. And well, no one's going to ask questions because they're intimidated by the brilliant power of the speech. So I stand up in the back of the room and I said, excuse me, I have a sore throat, but what about code section 148207B1? Would that apply? And he looked at me and he said, I'll tell you, I've been all over this country making this speech, and I got to tell you, that's the stupidest question I've ever heard in my life. Thank you very much.